The next time you walk down the grocery aisle, take a good hard look at the metal cans lining the shelves. They look permanent, don't they? A comforting, silver-plated illusion of endless supply and frozen prices. But behind those brightly colored paper labels, a quiet financial execution is taking place. By the time we cross the threshold of July 2026, 12 specific canned foods, staples that millions of households rely on as their ultimate financial safety nets, are on a direct trajectory to either spike into the luxury category or vanish from major retail networks entirely. This isn't about a corporate voluntary discontinuation or a temporary health recall. This is the cold, calculated math of modern retail logistics. When the cost to manufacture, ship, and stock a heavy metal cylinder exceeds the micro-margars a grocery chain can squeeze out of it, that product is dead. It gets quietly scrubbed from the inventory system between midnight reorder cycles, leaving nothing but an empty peg and an increased price tag on whatever resource-intensive alternative takes its place. And here is the psychological trap, the item on this list facing the most immediate. Terminal structural pressure isn't the premium wild sockeye salmon or the imported olive oil-packed delicacies. It is the absolute cheapest, most humble can in the entire store. A product that currently sells for under $2 and carries literally zero margin left to absorb the compounding shocks of our fragile supply chain. If you think the current price hikes are just a temporary blip that will magically correct themselves by next quarter, you are dangerously miscalculating how the global food apparatus actually functions. To understand why your pantry is about to become a battleground, we have to look at the massive, invisible friction driving this crisis, the terrifying reliance on international shipping and foreign processing labor. Take a look at number 12 on our casualty list, canned salmon. The average American shopper treats a can of pink salmon as an afterthought, a budget-friendly backup for a quick Friday night meal. But that single can is a logistical miracle that shouldn't even exist at its current price point. The United States imports a staggering 75 to 80% of its total consumed seafood. In a single recent year, that amounted to roughly 6.3 billion pounds of fish crossing our borders from hubs in Canada, Chile, and Norway. When you pull that can of salmon off the shelf, you aren't just paying for a fish caught in northern waters. You are paying for the staggering energy footprint of cold logistics, refrigerated shipping containers that must maintain a flawless, sub-zero temperature profile from the exact second that fish leaves the ocean until it is sealed inside an airtight hull of commodity-priced aluminum or steel. Fish cannot sit in a dry warehouse waiting for shipping rates to drop. If fuel prices tick up, if port congestion fees compound at major coastal choke points, or if foreign processing plants face localized energy grid failures, those expenses don't vanish into corporate balance sheets. They are pushed directly forward, accumulating interest across thousands of miles, until they land squarely on the grocery label you scan at checkout. But canned salmon is trapped in a double bind that separates it from almost every other dry good on the market. Most products suffer from pure, predictable economic inflation. Costs rise, margins shrink, and prices adapt. That is a human problem with human solutions. Canned salmon, however, is being crushed by a secondary force that no amount of financial engineering can fix: biological collapse. Wild salmon populations are hypersensitive anomalies. They depend on incredibly rigid ocean temperatures, highly predictable migration corridors, and entirely intact marine ecosystems to survive. Marine scientists tracking Pacific fisheries have conclusively proven that even a minuscule, fractional rise in baseline ocean temperatures completely derails juvenile salmon survival rates and shatters ancestral migration routes. When these biological systems break down, the raw volume of wild fish available to commercial canning operations doesn't just fluctuate. It contracts violently on a multi-year timeline. If global diesel prices drop tomorrow, a manufacturer can lower the cost of shipping a box of cereal. But you cannot optimize or force the reproductive cycle of a wild salmon population trapped in a warming ocean. The biology moves at its own stubborn pace, completely indifferent to the quarterly demands of Wall Street or the panic of a consumer watching their grocery budget disintegrate. Yet, from a sheer survival standpoint, the tragedy of losing these specific items is immense. A single standard can of salmon delivers over 20 grams of complete, highly bioavailable protein, a massive dose of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, crucial vitamin D. And, if you are smart enough to buy the traditional varieties containing the softened bones, an unrivaled natural source of dietary calcium. For long-term bone density, cardiovascular protection, and muscle retention under stress, this isn't a luxury health food supplement, it is an irreplaceable foundational matrix. If you are trying to insulate your household from the shelf clearing that will accelerate after July, your storage strategy must be highly deliberate. Prioritize wild-caught pink or sockeye variants with the bones left intact. You must become ruthless when inspecting the physical integrity of the packaging before it enters your inventory. A flat-faced dent on the side of a large can is usually cosmetic, but even a microscopic hairline dent along the top rim or the vertical welded seam compromises the hermetic seal entirely. The minute oxygen penetrates that barrier, botulinum risks skyrocket, turning a survival asset into a biohazard. Buy exclusively the longest available expiration horizons, arrange them strictly by date, and rotate your older stock forward relentlessly. The twin economic and ecological jaws are closing on this specific category right now, and the timeline to secure these dense nutritional reserves is shrinking far faster than the average consumer realizes. To fully dissect how the global food infrastructure arrived at this critical juncture, we have to look past the surface-level price tags and trace the structural policy decisions, legislative actions, and geographical bottlenecks that set this trajectory in motion years ago. The modern grocery shelf is not an organic reflection of supply and demand. It is the artificial product of decades of aggressive corporate consolidation, hyper-optimized just-in-time logistics, and a total reliance on fragile international trade corridors. The vulnerabilities we are seeing play out across the retail market today are the direct inevitable results of decisions made by major food syndicates and international regulatory bodies over the past 2 decades. Consider number 11 on the casualty list, canned tuna. For generations, this product served as the absolute baseline for cheap, shelf-stable protein in Western households. That baseline was built entirely on cheap overseas labor and unregulated high-seas fishing. In the early 2000s, major domestic tuna processors systematically dismantled their mainland American operations, moving the bulk of their canning facilities to Southeast Asian nations, primarily Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. By outsourcing the intensive labor of thawing, butchering, and packing fish to regions with significantly lower regulatory overhead, corporations artificially depressed the price of a standard 5-ounce can for nearly 20 years. This hyper-extended supply chain functioned perfectly as long as global maritime shipping remained cheap and predictable. However, international regulatory shifts have systematically dismantled this economic model. Under these International Maritime Organization's recent decarbonization mandates, commercial shipping fleets have been forced to transition to low-sulfur fuels and implement stricter emissions controls. These changes drastically increased ocean freight tariffs. According to container freight indices, the cost to move a standard 20-foot refrigerated container from the port of Bangkok to the port of Los Angeles has experienced severe structural upward pressure. When you factor in the rising cost of industrial tinplate steel, which experienced a sharp global price increase following international tariff disputes and smelting facility closures, the physical container frequently costs more to manufacture than the raw tuna inside it. This brings us to the operatai, onal reality of number 10, canned sardines. This specific category highlights the devastating compounding effect of localized climate events on interconnected food supplies. The primary economic vulnerability for sardines does not stem from the fish themselves, but from the liquid medium required to pack them. High-grade sardines are traditionally packed in pure olive oil. Between 2022 and 2025, consecutive historic droughts and extreme heat waves decimated agricultural yields across Spain, Italy, and Greece, the 3 nations responsible for over 2/3 of the world's olive oil production. According to data from the International Olive Council, global production plummeted to near-decade lows during this window, causing wholesale olive oil commodity prices to surge by more than 100% in less than 24 months. Canners could not absorb a doubling of their primary liquid ingredient cost while maintaining a low retail price point. As a direct result, manufacturers began quietly altering their product formulations, substituting premium olive oil with highly processed seed oils or water-based brines. For the consumer, this represented a profound degradation of both product quality and nutritional density. Sardines packed in olive oil contain high concentrations of stable monounsaturated fats that protect the delicate omega-3 fatty acids from oxidation over years of storage. When replaced with unstable polyunsaturated seed oils, the long-term shelf life changes drastically, accelerating the degradation of the fish inside the tin. The geographic trap becomes even more pronounced when examining number 9, canned mackerel. Mackerel is an incredibly high-yield, nutrient-dense pelagic fish that populates the cold waters of the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. Yet, it suffers from a fatal retail flaw: low consumer velocity in domestic supermarkets. In commercial grocery operations, shelf space is treated exactly like high-value real estate. Major retail chains utilize automated inventory management software that calculates the exact revenue yield per linear inch of shelf space. If a product does not hit specific weekly turnover metrics, the system automatically triggers a reduction in order volume, shifting that space to high-velocity, heavily marketed alternative goods. Because mackerel lacked the massive corporate advertising budgets enjoyed by mainstream tuna brands, American consumers never adopted it at scale. Consequently, as international distribution networks tightened their operations to cut costs, regional distribution hubs began completely eliminating low-turnover seafood lines to optimize warehouse capacity. This structural retreat from the market is an invisible process. The product does not disappear because of an acute shortage of fish in the ocean. It disappears because the logistical friction of transporting a low-demand item across an ocean makes it an operational liability for the modern supermarket distributor. A completely different historical failure underpins number 8, canned corned beef. The crisis facing this heavily processed, calorie-dense staple is tied directly to domestic livestock policy and multi-year ecological trends within the North American cattle industry. Over the past decade, persistent, severe droughts across the American Southwest and the Great Plains systematically destroyed historic grazing pastures. Facing catastrophic water shortages and skyrocketing costs for supplemental alfalfa feed, domestic ranchers were forced to conduct massive, premature liquidations of their breeding herds. Data released by the United States Department of Agriculture confirmed that by the start of 2026, the total domestic cattle inventory had contracted to its lowest absolute level in over 60 years. A contraction of this magnitude cannot be corrected by an adjustment in manufacturing speed. The biological timeline required to rebuild a national beef herd takes years, requiring multiple successive calving cycles under optimal environmental conditions. With the domestic supply of raw beef heavily constrained, meat packers naturally redirected their limited supply toward high-margin, fresh primal cuts for premium steakhouses and supermarket butcher counters. The raw utility beef cuts traditionally reserved for industrial canning operations suddenly faced intense competition, driving the wholesale price of canning-grade beef to historic highs. For families relying on canned corned beef as an affordable, long-term protein reserve, the macroeconomics of the cattle ranch landed directly on their kitchen tables, pricing a traditional poverty food out of the reach of the very demographics that depended on it most. Moving past the geopolitical bottlenecks and ecological constraints of the agricultural supply chain reveals the immediate operational friction occurring within local distribution centers, processing plants, and corporate boardrooms. The crisis has progressed from a distant logistical slowdown into an acute operational struggle between state regulatory regimes, corporate margin management, and the baseline dietary needs of the consumer base. As we enter the third quarter of 2026, the retail environment is defined by an aggressive consolidation of inventory, designed to protect corporate profitability at the direct expense of product diversity and consumer affordability. This structural clash is highly visible in the execution of number 7 on the casualty list, canned chickpeas. While legumes are historically renowned for their rugged shelf stability, their modern distribution is entirely hostage to intense international trade policy and erratic regional export restrictions. India and specific regions within the Mediterranean corridor control the dominant market share of global chickpea cultivation. In response to unpredictable domestic crop yields driven by persistent heat domes across the subcontinent, foreign agricultural ministries have repeatedly implemented strict export quotas and punitive tariffs to stabilize their internal food security. These protectionist policies have caused immediate ripples across Western import markets. Domestic food packagers, unable to secure consistent, high-volume shipments of raw chickpeas, are forcing their processing facilities to run well below maximum capacity, driving up the per-unit operational cost of every single can produced. At the retail level, this manifests as a stark prioritization of high-margin corporate labels over generic store brands. Supermarket chains are actively using their limited allocations of chickpeas to stock premium, organic, pre-seasoned varieties that command a higher retail price, systematically starving out the plain, budget-priced cans that lower-income households rely on for affordable, dense plant-based protein and fiber. Simultaneously, number 6, canned coconut milk, illustrates the severe vulnerability of extreme geographic manufacturing concentration. The domestic market relies almost entirely on imports from Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, with Thailand alone historically controlling the vast majority of the supply flowing into American supermarkets. This complete lack of domestic production means that any regulatory or logistical shift at the ports of Southeast Asia translates instantly to American grocery shelves. Throughout the past year, international labor compliance crackdowns regarding harvesting practices in Southeast Asian plantations have forced extensive audits across major exporters, stalling thousands of tons of raw material at processing docks because full-fat canned coconut milk is an incredibly dense source of medium-chain triglycerides. It serves as a critical caloric foundation for individuals managing strict dietary restrictions or preparing long-term emergency reserves. However, major grocery syndicates do not classify coconut milk as an essential commodity. Faced with compressed margins due to escalating trans-Pacific container freight rates and mandatory third-party verification costs, corporate buyers are aggressively reducing their SKU counts, completely eliminating mid-tier brands and leaving only a single high-priced national brand on the shelf. This pattern of structural contraction extends directly to number 5, canned evaporated milk. This product is whole milk that has undergone an industrial thermal process to remove roughly 60% of its natural water content without the addition of sugar, resulting in a highly versatile, shelf-stable dairy concentrate. The production of evaporated milk is being squeezed by two distinct economic forces: domestic dairy stabilization policies and skyrocketing industrial packaging overhead. According to monthly reports from the United States Department of Agriculture, all milk prices have sustained elevated baselines due to ongoing volatility in regional cattle feed costs and structural reductions in domestic herd sizes, as raw milk costs remain high. Commercial dairy cooperatives are redirecting their fluid volumes into higher velocity, higher margin fresh products, such as butter and cheese, which face immediate consumer demand. The volume allocated to industrial evaporation plants has dropped significantly. Compounding this supply restriction is the soaring cost of the tin-coated steel cans required for long-term dairy preservation. Because evaporated milk requires precise thermal processing inside the sealed can to ensure sterilization without caramelization, the structural integrity of the metal container cannot be compromised. As the manufacturing cost of these specialized cans escalates, major food processors are quietly shifting their production lines away from small, consumer-facing cans toward massive industrial-sized bladders, destined for commercial bakeries and institutional food service providers, effectively cutting off the retail consumer from a traditional pantry staple. The most catastrophic manifestation of this geographic and logistical concentration risk is found in number 4, canned tomatoes. This category forms the absolute backbone of weekly meal preparation for millions of families, serving as the essential base for pasta sauces, chilis, and stews. Yet, the physical reality of this industry is remarkably fragile. More than 90% of the processing tomatoes, grown and canned in the United States, originate from a single highly localized agricultural zone, the Central Valley of California. This extreme geographic centralization means that the entire nation's canned tomato supply is entirely dependent on the stability of one regional water infrastructure system and localized climate patterns. Prolonged structural droughts across the western United States have forced state authorities to implement strict water tier allocations, drastically increasing the cost of agricultural irrigation. Furthermore, the energy costs required to pump deep groundwater to sustain these massive industrial fields have surged. Unlike dry grains or legumes that can be stored post-harvest, processing tomatoes must be transported from the field to the canning facility within hours of picking to prevent spoilage. This creates an intense reliance on regional diesel trucking networks during the peak summer harvest window. The combination of surging agricultural water tariffs, high seasonal fuel surcharges, and escalating labor costs under extreme heat regulations has pushed the baseline production cost of canned tomatoes to a tipping point. Corporate food conglomerates are responding by consolidating their product offerings, reducing the availability of specialized varieties like crushed or whole-peeled plum tomatoes, and forcing consumers toward highly processed, low-density tomato pastes or expensive imported alternatives.